long-term videos.
Does anyone have a pen I can point with? Okay, perfect, thank you. Okay, so there's a lot that you can see on the half head.
First, give me your email. I'll send it to you.
Okay. First off, a couple of common misconceptions that people sometimes make. This is not the subarachnoid space. Now, a lot of people may think it is at first, but you'll find if you compare in your pictures and your notes, it's not the subarachnoid space. This is the superior longitudinal sinus. So that is a sinus of the falx cerebri. You'll see that later on. But as far as the actual layers of the cranial meninges, you can't really see them clearly on this model. So don't worry too much about those. Now the structures you can see, you have the cerebrum, you have the cerebellum, you have the central brain and the brain stem, and you have the spinal cord. Now basically each one of these has a white matter connection that connects the right hemisphere to the left hemisphere, and they all serve the same function. They connect the right to the left. You have the corpus callosum, which connects the right cerebral cortex to the left cerebral cortex. So it just goes right through the two hemispheres. You also have the arbor vitae, which is the white matter connection between the right hemisphere of the cerebellum and the left hemisphere of the cerebellum, which, pointedly enough, you can only see the shape of the tree of life if you cut through the vernix of the cerebellum, because that is the center where they come together. Elsewhere in the cerebellum, if you cut through it, you won't see this tree of life shape, even though the white matter will still be there. You have the fornix, which is another white matter connection, and it's more central brain that it connects right and left. So it's kind of limbic system. There's an overlap between the limbic system and the rest of the brain. It's not very clearly defined where one begins and the other ends. You also have the intermediary mass, which connects the right and the left thalamus together. That's the little guy that puts a hole, so to speak, in the ventricle. So you have your corpus callosum, fornix, intermediary mass, arbor vitae, and those are your white matter connections between the right and left hemispheres. Now, as far as the specific bodies go, you have your thalamus here, with the hypothalamus being the region underneath it. You'll get very familiar with the hypothalamus when you study the endocrine system. Here you have the pineal gland, which produces melatonin, which controls our circadian rhythm. Circadian from circa, dia, circa meaning about, dia meaning a day, so it's about a day, that's our daily cycle. You have your optic chiasm here. It may not quite look like what you think the optic chiasm would look like, but if you compare the brains that pull in half, where you see the clear X shape from the bottom, and you pull it in half, you'll notice that this structure's right there in the middle, where it's cutting through the middle of the X. This is the pituitary gland sitting in the sala turcica. It's connected to the hypothalamus by the infundibulum. Now, between the fornix and the corpus callosum, you have this region here. It kind of looks like an empty space or a gap in here, so some people may make the mistake of thinking that it's one of the ventricles. It is not. This is the septum pellucidum. A septum is a wall that separates two cavities from each other. Those cavities, which are completely inside the hemispheres so that you cannot see them, are the lateral ventricles. So this is the wall that separates the right and left lateral ventricle from each other. So it's a solid wall, it's not an empty space. So this vascular piece right here with all these blood vessels through this is the choroid plexus. This is not the only choroid plexus in the brain. There is one choroid plexus in every ventricle because this is part of the production of CSF. This is the choroid plexus of the third ventricle. This entire region here is the third ventricle, and it's filled with CSF. It flows through this canal right here, which is called the aqueduct, into the fourth ventricle, which is this region here. From there, it flows into the central canal. You cannot see the central canal in this model, but it's there. So you have your midbrain right here. The midbrain is the connection from the brainstem to the cerebrum. It's not as clear why that is in this model, but it's more clear in the full brains, but this is also known as the cerebral peduncle. You cannot see the cerebellar peduncle in this model because it's off to the sides. This sagittal cut is right through the middle, so you can't see it. It's between them. But nevertheless, there's a cerebral peduncle, which connects the brainstem to the cerebrum, and a cerebellar peduncle, which connects the brainstem to the cerebellum. So the midbrain and the cerebral peduncle are the same thing. That's that region right there. This is the medulla oblongata. This opening right here is the foramen magnum. Beyond this point, it ceases being the medulla oblongata and is the spinal column. This is the pons right here. And this region right here is supposed to represent the corpora quadrigemini, where this top portion is the superior colliculus, and this bottom portion is the inferior colliculus. Let's see. Did I cover everything I needed to cover?
I don't want to be annoying, but do you want to use this to point? Dr. Pickle yells at us whenever we don't.
Yeah, well,
He yells at us all the time.
Sure, I'll switch to that.
How about the
All right.
olives? Can you see that on?
No, not on this model. The olives you have to see on a full 3D brainstem because they're kind of on the sides.
All right.
They're along with the pyramids.
All right.
This is the mammillary body. You can see that. It's called the mammillary body because it's only found in mammals, not because it has anything to do with the breasts, but because it's only found in mammals. And the mammillary body has to do with salivation, hunger, chewing. It's related to actions like that. Now I want to go over this in a moment of circulation of cerebrospinal fluid. It's always important to understand circulation of CSF. It comes from the blood and it goes back to the blood. The choroid plexus is where it gets it from the blood. The difference in composition between CSF and blood is not very much. It's the same plasma, it's the same nutrients and gases, it's the same minerals, it's the same proteins. The only difference is there's a different concentration of it and it's not flooded with red blood cells. So you get all those ingredients from the blood supply and it squeezes out through the choroid plexus here into the ventricle. And it's further supplemented by secretions from the ependymal cells that line the entire ventricle.
Right.
So the lateral ventricles will flow into the third ventricle will flow through the aqueduct into the fourth ventricle, and the fourth ventricle will flow down through the central canal. Now, even though it's flowing in that direction, each ventricle is still producing its own CSF in addition to the flow. So it goes down through the central canal all the way down until it gets to the bottom of the spinal column, where it's no longer solid after the conus medullaris, and it becomes open-ended, where it's in the quada equina. At that point, the central canal is no longer contained, and the CSF floods into the subarachnoid space. From there, it continues flooding into that area, so it flows back up the subarachnoid space around the spinal column and around the brain. The CSF continues flowing all the way up towards the top, where it pierces into the sinuses through arachnoid granulations, which are not shown on this model. So this sinus is not only filling with venous deposits, but it's also filling with CSF. So it's starting to mix back with the blood here. The sinuses drain into venous supplies, which will drain into the jugular, which go back into the blood supply. So the CSF comes from the blood, goes through the ventricles, and goes back into the blood. Let's see.
The foramen, the cerebral foramen, isn't it? Like right here. Is that where it would be?
Oh, the
what is it?
I know what you're talking about, and that's a stupid name for it.
Intervertebral foramen.
Yeah, the intervertebral, or intervertebral?
Interventricular.
Interventricular, yeah. The interventricular foramen. That's a stupid name for it. It is not a foramen. Your ventricles are empty spaces that are filled with fluid. A foramen is a hole. How can you have a hole in an empty space? It's actually a solid mass that passes through and interrupts that empty space. And I hate that it's called an interventricular foramen. Know that in case it comes up on your tests, but also know that it's a stupid name, because really all that is the intermediary mass.
That's it.
That's all it is. It connects the right and left, so it pierces through the ventricle, so there's a space that the fluid cannot fulfill. They call that a foramen, but it's really not a hole. It's a lack of a hole.
Yeah. Making it more confusing, huh?
Yep. They just like renaming things, I guess.
So what's the difference between the intermediate mass and the interventricular foramen?
Nothing. There is no
They're
difference.
the same thing.
They are the same thing.
And there's
I'm gonna
it's
turn
right
off
here
that
what
camera
is
or
it?
it's gonna.
This whole area?
No.
from the
That's part of the third ventricle. This is all part of the third ventricle. That number 11 with the arrow is referring to the choroid plexus.
So that one is not the
No.
interventricular foramen.
The intermediary mass is the interventricular foramen.
But on our lab manual, we have two names.
Yeah, they're two names for the same thing.
Oh,
The foramen and Monroe, so I guess another name.
Oh, the foramen of Monroe. Yeah,
Same
it's
thing.
still the same
Right,
thing.
right.
But
So
once
actually
again,
both
it's a
of them
stupid
is the
name
same
because it's
design.
not a foramen.
That's gonna get me.
Yeah.
Get me.
because we always thought that one is the foramen and that one is intermediate mass.
No, they are both the same thing. The intermediary mass, the foramen of Monroe, and the ventricular foramen are all the exact same thing. If we look at that brain over there, I'll show you what I mean.